Thank you, Amon, and thank you, Colin. It's my pleasure to participate in this panel, especially in collaboration with MinSouth. So thank you so much for collaborating with us on this. And I think before I start, I'd like to make a proclamation. And I'll say it's a proclamation that I'm making, but I do hope that Women in Mining UK and MinSouth would afford me the honor of extending this proclamation on behalf of both entities. And that proclamation is, of course, in solidarity with all Indigenous peoples around the world. As an individual who supports the rights of Indigenous communities, I think it's important that we as a whole, and I know we have someone joining, can we please mute? Sorry, thank you. Yes, so not that it will quiet my proclamation, it'll just make me speak louder, that it's important that we support the rights of Indigenous peoples to preserve and reconstruct, more importantly, their traditional cultures and the rights to their self-determination. And I hope that as an industry, we can support and help drive this inclusive industry. So with that, thank you for affording me that piece. It's very important that we as an industry really make that stand, and we'll work with Indigenous communities to make our industry more inclusive and more responsible. And I hope that this panel today will shed light in the importance around this very issue. Now, after my proclamation, and I'm going to say the proclamation of Women in Mining UK and MinSouth, it's my pleasure to introduce this formidable panel of Indigenous women. Joining us, we have Kathy Lajeunesse, who is the partnership liaison at Keepers of the Circle, Florence Drummond, a fellow Women in Mining leader, who is the co-founder of Indigenous Women in Mining and Resources of Australia. Then we have Lana Eagle, who is a senior advisor and consultant at Lana Eagle Consulting, but an Indigenous woman who sits on many boards. I think that's very important to note. And then we have Murindeni Makado, who is membership lead at Women in Mining South Africa. And I love the fact that we have a South African representative, because I'd like the mining community to really think about the definition of the Indigenous person and the Indigenous woman and what that means beyond our traditional definition of indigeneity. So with that, please join us for this constructive conversation. And I want us to think of this conversation in terms of how do we build a mining sector that is constructive when it comes to not only the Indigenous issues, but the issues of Indigenous women in the sector. What are the challenges? How far have we come? And how much further do we have to go? So with that, I want to jump right in, and I'll ask my panelists that when I refer to you, that before you answer, please, in your own voice, introduce yourself and who you represent and what is your purpose here today. So my first panel to the question is, what are the current issues that women in the industry, and maybe we can frame it first from the Indigenous lens, Indigenous peoples in the industry, what are the issues that we're currently facing that maybe we still have not yet tackled? And particularly, what are the nuanced issues that impact Indigenous women in the industry from your jurisdiction and from your engagement with other Indigenous communities? And I'd like to turn to Florence first as someone who is leading this conversation from the Indigenous Women in Mining lens. Florence, please.
Hello, everyone. It's so lovely to be here with you all. As a Dara Butiti woman, I'd like to acknowledge the Wajak people of the Noongar Nation of the lands on which I speak today and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And thank you all for being with us. And I acknowledge everyone else who's on the panel today who will be sharing their stories. So I represent Indigenous women in mining and resources here in Australia. And certainly our growth as a network, as a volunteer network across the last 7 years has been one that's been robust and a steep learning curve. I've been in mining for 10 years, started off as an operator, and since then has grown a network for Indigenous women, not only across Australia, but now finding our reach globally. And still what we find with one of those biggest challenges is our growth or our trajectory out of poverty. So all of those residual challenges that we have in our communities are still so impactful to our everyday lives as Indigenous women. So we've always had to walk that fine line. And again, being an Indigenous woman in the mining sector, as we all know here, is such a fragile conversation. So you have your communities who sometimes don't understand what you're doing, but also what I found across Australia and certainly with our network and my own family is the context of our relationship with mining. So they're from the industry, and in the regions that are mining regions, it's a different relationship to people who live in the cities. So their comprehension and understanding of mining and how it plays its part in everyday life is very different. So, and still across the board, I do find that it's a growing conversation, but a slow one as well. So as much as we appreciate time in the time it takes to understand, there are still some things that we need to address with a sense of urgency as well.
And I like this point about the fragility of the conversation. I think talking about how fragile that conversation can become to the point where we're not able to move beyond so that we can actually, as an industry, we can actually have those meaningful conversations that would then get to the heart of the issues. And, Lana, I'll probably turn to you as a woman who is on a board, who is an Indigenous woman representing at board level. How are you seeing this fragility in conversation? Maybe with your presence, moving beyond that, maybe one that hasn't been constructive to one that could be constructive.
Well, good morning, everyone. I am calling in from British Columbia, which is on the west coast of Canada. So it's a civil time for me. It's 10 a.m. and thank you for arranging it for being at this time when I'm probably the most alert, if you will. Poor Florence, middle of the night for her, but this is what happens when you have a global panel. But I'm very happy to be living and working on the traditional territories of the Wiwikai, the Wiwikam, and the Quayaka people. And Campbell River is one of the most beautiful spots in the world. So my ascension into directorships has been taking place for quite a while, but most recently I'm now sitting on 2 corporate boards. I'm also on the board of PDAC, the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada, as well as Geoscience BC. And I think we're at a time, especially here in Canada, where we're beginning to regard the importance of an Indigenous viewpoint at the board level. And I can say that honestly, my experience so far has been very, very good in the sense that I am respected. And it's kind of that layer that we look through when we're examining potential projects or how we're going to work with community. And it helps those who are non-Indigenous to understand and see things differently. And I think that's where we are, where especially here in Canada, especially here in the province of BC, where we enacted the DRIPA, Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People Act, in late 2019, and then later in Canada, Canada followed suit at the federal level with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So it's how do we implement that? I know that that's what they're working at, but I think it finally gives us a voice as Indigenous people. But not only that, I think what really struck me was that we now have our human rights regarded, which many people, probably all of you, can take for granted. And, it's life changing, really. Very fortunate on my part that I how I was raised and how I grew up and where I grew up that I always thought I had human rights. But I think it was in 2019 when I realized that maybe I hadn't really had human rights as all Canadians have experienced. But I think we're at that place where in society here, we are beginning to acknowledge the voices of Indigenous people and how they can contribute economically to our society. So we're starting, I think we saw it earlier in mining and mineral exploration when companies just did the right thing because that's how they were led by people who really felt that they must do the right thing, that they should do the right thing. And to me, it's a response of humanity when you are inclusive and consider the peoples that are the landholders, the rights holders of the area, as well as newcomers to Canada. So it's just an openness of heart. That's what I can boil it down to. And we have to start seeing our entire workforce that way, not just at the corporate level, but also out in the field, in where operations are occurring. And how do we treat those people with respect? And how do we acknowledge their existence? I think we're starting to see more of that in our industry, but it is there's a lot of growth ahead of us, and those do involve fragile conversations, but I think we can do it with openness and honesty, and begin to put our hearts in the right place. And I'm excited to see that happening now across Canada, and I'm sure it's starting to happen globally as well.
Well, I think this conversation is, especially within the UK context, is helping to grow that. So thank you for that, Lana. And there are a few points that I really want to touch on, especially the openness of heart and those key individuals who are probably leading and maybe them needing a bit more visibility in the way that their leadership is guiding the conversation. But before I do, I, I'd like to bring in Kathy into this conversation, leading a civil society focused around Indigenous women and their participation. Kathy, what are some of the issues that you're still seeing, and can you talk us through what Keepers of the Circle's mandate is and how you're working towards addressing some of these issues?
Okay, Stacy, thank you so very much for that. Please let me know when you want me to be quiet, because I have so much I could say here on that one big open question. First of all, I
Yes.
want to say thank you very much for the kind invitation. My name is Kathy Lajness. I'm coming at you from Kirkland Lake, which is a little wee tall, small town, about 8,000 people right now in northeastern Ontario, very close to the border with Quebec. I'm coming to you from uh, this area, this land that I work and live on, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people, including Ojibwe, Algonquin, and Métis Nation of Ontario. So my particular forte here at Keepers of the Circle is that we are an Indigenous hub created in both Kirkland Lake and northeastern Ontario, operated by our original name, Temiskaming Native Women Support Group. We're a not-for-profit, started in 1997 to support the cultural, social, and economic equity of Indigenous women. We started off with one office. 25 years later, we've got 2 centers equipped with daycares, Indigenous healthcare centers, and a training center. And this is my place here in Kirkland Lake as the training center and as a partnership liaison. Um, we have grown our programming and services over the past 2 decades to expand beyond our pre-employment training program that I'm here to talk to you about today. And that pre-employment training program started off being called Aboriginal Women in Mining. So now we're growing it to include some of the gaps that have existed over the past 2 decades, making sure that our training can now be more sector specific, including the new skilled trades like green construction, clean energy, food, and agriculture. And so our hubs are multi-generational community gathering places with on-site health clinics, childcare services, and cultural and family programs and skills development training programs. 2 hubs, Kirkland Lake and Temiskaming Shores, Minamishkiki here in my building, with my daycare at the other end here in Kirkland Lake, and in Temiskaming Shores, the Minamishkiki Indigenous Healthcare Clinic is located within their hospital. And we have a Scott Street residence with our daycare there and cultural programming, and we have a Shepherdson Street residence with our daycare. So in 2018, our mandate extended as we became the Ontario representative of the Native Women's Association of Canada, and we're stretching our national reach now so that we can share our lessons to support building localized capacity across other Indigenous communities. And so I guess, shall I get into why Aboriginal women in mining?
I would love that. I know why, but I'd love to hear from you. Yes, Kathy.
Okay. So back when my founder, Ann Batiste, was asked to run a pre-employment, a life skills-based pre-employment training program for Matachewan First Nation to which she and her partner Mario belong. Mario is also an elder on our Wisdom Keepers. There was an Aboriginal employment preference policy, but it wasn't gender specific back then, and it didn't include any Indigenous hiring policies, either provincially or hiring quotas in the impact benefit agreements. And so what we say is that colonialism was and still is the lay of the land, and it's created systemic barriers and issues for Indigenous women, especially in mining. I'm not saying anything different here, folks, than what I said at PDAC just this past year when we were speaking in the Indigenous Forum. And my topic was why Indigenous women in mining is a golden opportunity. Okay. So although women are increasingly entering the mining sector, it still continues to remain male-dominated. That's just a given, folks. The Responsible Mining Foundation's report shows that despite much talk about gender and women, gender action is still very thin on the ground at the mine sites, including for women mine workers. One of the biggest challenges keepers of the circle faced by Indigenous women who are working at our mines is gender-based violence and harassment, both above and below ground. And this is despite all the mines and all of their safety practices and policies that they have in place, as safety is a number one key issue for them as well. So this is where we see Keepers of the Circle coming into play to ensure that our Indigenous women are put into safe, physically safe, and culturally safe work environments. So it's particularly part of my job here. I used to be a program practitioner delivering our pre-employment training program, Aboriginal Women in Mining, which has done a name change to Culture, Confidence, and Competence. We call it our CCC program because it is embedded in culture, leading to our Indigenous women feeling more confident about who they are, how they see themselves, and the rights that they are more familiarized with while in training with us.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
so Kathy, one thing that I really love is this culture, confidence, and competence narrative. I think that's quite key because there's a journey of being able to, for the women themselves, to feel that they also belong in that space.
Yes.
And and I wonder, how do we translate that from the other side, from the mining communities, from the miners' side, working with the keepers of the circle? For example, whether it's your keepers of the circle or maybe another version elsewhere.
Right.
How does that work? And I'm saying that now because I'd like you to think about it, and I'd like the panelists to think about it. But I want to bring in Murindeni to the conversation before we move on to this.
Okay.
And I have Murindeni, who is representing South Africa, and I think that's an interesting context, especially you mentioned, Kathy, the gender-based violence and discrimination piece. And I'm wondering, what are some of the challenges that women in South Africa, especially those who might stake claim to indigeneity to South Africa, feel are still the issues that they face in participating in the mining sector. Murindeni, please introduce yourself.
All right, evening everyone. It's evening the side in South Africa. I'm Morendeni Makado and I'm the membership lead for WIMSA, which is Women in Mining South Africa. So WIMSA is a not-for-profit organization that was founded in 2010. It's completely run by volunteers. And the whole aim of WIMSA is to attract women to the mining industry of South Africa. As Kathy mentioned, it's an extremely male-dominated industry, but not just stopping at attracting women to the industry, but making sure that we retain them in the industry and ensuring that they are promoted to actually meaningful positions or positions that are decision making. So WIMSA does that and empowers women in a personal and professional capacity through a number of programs that are there in place. So in terms of attracting women to the industry, we do run career fairs wherein we go to different high schools and we try instill that interest in mining and showcasing the beauty of the mining industry to schoolgirls at a young age. And then to retain them, we've got a flagship program, which is our mentoring program, wherein we give them skills to actually prove themselves in the industry, skills to keep them interested in the industry, and also promotion that's done through now our technical section, wherein we bring in interesting topics of interesting things that are happening in mining so that women actually talk the language of the mining industry, which makes them valuable in the industry as well. So in my portfolio as a membership lead, we engage with a number of operations within the South African context, wherein different operations have their own operational based WIM committees, which are women in mining committees. So what we do is we empower organizations that do not have their own committees. We assist them in starting up their own committees. And those that have the committees, we just give them the right tools to ensure that their committees are effective, to ensure that they achieve the goals that they have set and they achieve the outcomes that they have set. So to come to your question, Stacy, in terms of some of the challenges that we've seen facing women in mining, there are issues that face women in mining in general, which we have alluded to some of them, which is gender-based violence. There's the issue of keeping women in the industry. It's easy for them to come in, but keeping them there, it's a very difficult task. We've seen a number of women actually leave the industry. And there's the issue of the facilities. I mean, in South Africa, women were only legally allowed to start working in the mining industry from 1996. So that's just almost 3 decades. So the facilities, some of the facilities are not equipped for women. You can see even with some of the clothing that you have to wear, the women's shape is different from a man's shape. So obviously women clothing has to be custom made. But those are issues that face women in general in the mining industry. And there are issues that are specific to Indigenous women in the industry. As we know, different people of different cultures are raised in different ways. You've got different practices, you've got different languages. Those in some way become a barrier when you get to the mining industry. I'll just give an example. Most of the African cultures, for a woman, you are raised that when you talk to a man, you face down. So you get to a mining industry, when you talk to somebody, you have to look them in the face to show your confidence, to show you know what you're talking about. But in the back of your head, it's instilled that you look down. So that's obviously sometimes misinterpreted for this person is not confident or it's not sure, whereas it's just cultural differences. So there's also the issue of language, wherein we see Indigenous women, they know their story, they know what they're doing, but because of the language barriers, sometimes they are not able to fully express themselves. So those ones actually mark down Indigenous women. So that's where we've seen that there are certain issues that now come down to Indigenous women as opposed to women in general in the mining industry.
And you have touched on so much there, Murindeni, especially the institutional and the systemic barriers. And the fact that we're entering into a mining culture that actually isn't responsive to maybe an Indigenous culture or to another culture coming in. So I'm now wondering, what are some thoughts around how do we then break down some of these institutional and systemic barriers that face women entering in the industry, but also staying in the industry? And um, maybe I see Lana, I see your head going, like, yes, yes. I feel like it's resonating with you. So maybe you'd like to start off.
Sure. Interestingly, I just got off a call this morning with a company that I'll be doing some work for, well-known company in the mining industry, but they realize it's time to educate their people on the Indigenous people in whose territories they're working in. And it sounds easy, but so what they're doing is they've created a training program that they created internally that will be sent out to all of their staff members. And then I will come in and facilitate discussions as an Indigenous person, but also helping them better understand, why are we here today? What got us here? Because I think in Canada, there was probably a very academic understanding of truth and reconciliation. But in 2021, when the unmarked graves were discovered, around residential schools, I think that really woke up a lot of Canadians. And now there is this wanting to know more and to understand better the plight of Indigenous peoples in Canada. So we are at a remarkable place. Um, but I think a lot of this, can be initially addressed through education and awareness training. But I think the second part to that is to create mentorship programs for young women, Indigenous women entering the industry, and maybe not to be mentored by a male, but culturally by a female that they can talk to and figure out how to work in this landscape, in this culture. And so not only is there an awareness training program of culture for non-Indigenous people, but I also think Indigenous people need to learn, what is a mining culture. And every company has their own culture. It may be toxic, it may be non-toxic, it may be a very good working place. But I think that's the kind of information that can be passed to new employees, to new people, to our industry, through a mentorship program. So it's something that may be a little bit costly to put this in place, because you're taking people away from the job to have these discussions. But I think in the end, it'll work out to be more positive for not only the individual, but for the company as well.
I feel as though a lot of the women on the panel, if not everyone on the panel, would probably agree with you on that. And I know, I think Florence and Kathy, you can add a bit more in regards to what you're doing in your territories, but also what you're doing globally, especially you, Florence, with your global lens that you're aligning with Indigenous women in mining in Australia.
Yeah, definitely. And I've really appreciated the points that everyone's made as well in the panel. It definitely does resonate with us here in Australia as well, and through our learnings that we've had. Two things I'd like to raise. I think the first thing for us has always been connection, and connection to each other. So across Australia, there's many Indigenous women. The last count was around about 1,300 Indigenous women in the sector itself. So that's certainly increased since then, with internal champion campaigns to employ Indigenous people, and particularly women. And of course, that's aligned to the federal government's policies around a certain percentage of Indigenous women or people employed, and a certain percentage of Indigenous businesses being engaged throughout the mining sector. So that's helped our introduction, engagement, and somewhat retention to some degree. But what we've found at IWIMRA is that we've never had the opportunity to connect in person, for a very long time. And I think that's what we're really focused on, is connecting first, because our understanding, our concept, and our interpretation of mentoring is very different. And, just like what Lana and the other two women also said on the panel, is how do we ensure that cultural safety is there, and first and foremost, to then build our confidence to and I think, you know, language is also an important thing as well. So I'm always mindful of the words that I say to describe who we are and how we participate and where we're going. So I think for all of that, we really need to come together first to have that sounding board together to really understand who we are, how we represent ourselves, and what we need to do, because it's not a new problem. It's not a new issue that suddenly someone's just discovered that Indigenous people are an important component to this value chain. So that's certainly something that we've always been aware of, is how do we reach out to people and how to reach out to other organizations to help us understand and unpack that through the lens internationally as well, but also regionally. And I just want to quickly mention something internationally. So when we first started growing our capacity as Indigenous, as a group for Indigenous women, we really had to find out where we belonged. And so the reason why we created this network is because that we couldn't find any representation for us throughout the region. So we needed to connect to each other and figure out what we wanted to do. But certainly our participation in UN forums and mining forums gave us that sound understanding on where the conversation about Indigenous participation was, and then where we, as from the operational point of view, or all of our women, where we could actually create impact, but also raise our voice and visibility. So it's definitely a moving conversation. I'd like it to be moving better, and of course much more impactful, and in the sense that we're doing it together, you know, on a global level. Because I do think that even though there are language barriers between us as Indigenous women, there's so much more opportunity for us to do some great things together and really shift the dial for us.
And that point about moving the conversation and also the visibility around that. I know, Kathy, you have been traveling as well regionally, from trade show, PDAC to smaller ones across Canada. And you also have talked about this cultural safety piece. And how are you, I guess my curiosity is, how are you translating that when you travel to these trade shows? And what's the reception from the mining communities? Lana, you touched on the fact that in Canada it's now actually sticking because people have become more aware, and there's a new sensitivity to Indigenous communities that that didn't exist before, unfortunately, because of something so devastating to have emerged, that people are now aware, and they're now scrutinizing their own thought process behind engagement and what that means and defining it. So, Kathy, I'd love to understand, how are you translating that cultural safety piece? Because I think that's beautiful. I haven't heard it before, and as someone who works quite closely with Indigenous communities, I'd love to understand that as well. I'm sure a lot of us in the mining sector would really like to understand how we can be a bit more purposeful through this cultural safety piece.
Well, Stacy, again, how long do I have? There's so much to say, but let's go fast. So it stems, first of all, when we're at these mining trade shows, we're bringing our flyers, sharing the information about our pre-employment training program called the Culture, Confidence, and Competence Program, and why that's a good go for First Nation communities to recommend their women to take, because of what the outcomes could be for these women. And so that Culture, Confidence, and Competence program is an 8-week program. It's delivered in a life skills model, and it covers these units. So we do a whole week of career exploration. We do personal skill development. We look at health and wellness. We look at professional skill development. And at the end of it, then it's the sector-specific training dependent upon where they're going. So we've had that long-term partnership with what is now owned by Agnico Eagle, the Detour Lake Gold Mine. And up at Detour Lake, they've done a very good job working with the Indigenous communities that they have impact benefit agreements with. And so there has been some real attention paid to making sure that the Indigenous peoples from the communities that have an impact benefit agreement going off to Detour Lake Gold Mine can have a good experience while they are there, and want to return and build that intergenerational sequence of what we've seen in our program is mothers coming here to Keepers of the Circle and taking our old Aboriginal Women in Mining program, and now that it's evolved into the Triple C program, and we're still working with the partnership with Detour Lake Gold Mine and Moose Cree First Nation and Tequatagamu Nation, is that their sons are now coming into the program and saying, I want to be a rock truck driver just like my mom. And so it's not just the same old going on anymore. So we're very proud of our program. We go around promoting it. I'm going to tell you that it's delivered in a safe and inclusive space that follows the 7 grandfather teachings every day of the program. And every day of the program, there's 2 Indigenous co-facilitators and an elder in that group, both the online group and in the in-person group in my classroom. And so this is a very unique opportunity for Indigenous women or Indigenous peoples, when we team up with the First Nation communities, to be able to seek the advice of an elder and to have one-on-one with an elder. That's not always possible. It's not always that it's in our daily lives that we could go sit with an elder and ask them the questions that we need to know, and ask some personal questions as well, and them be open to it, and to be able to share in a way that is clear. Because for some of our elders, it might take a long time for the story to come out, but the lesson is in the story if everybody is listening. And so what I want to say is, through our Triple C program, the cultural significance in it is built into the curriculum every day. So it's not like we're going to have a cultural day and that's it. That is not it. We also do cultural days where we support it with bringing in the supplies in our cultural support, family support cultural worker. Brianna just had an open beading night last night. So all of the women in our group are welcome to come on back at night and do an open beading night. We've also had things like making moccasins. We've had traditional healers in offering naming ceremonies and colors. But it doesn't just stop in the classroom. And so what we're looking at is, how do we move it from the classroom to the work environment? Because what we've got going on at Detour Lake is, after they've done our art training program, the gold mine has established placements for, say if we start with a group of 20, we end up with a group of 15. The gold mine has established 15 placements for those members to be trained in the different departments at the mine, with a job attached to it at the end of the 20-week placement.
And Kathy, so we have this pipeline of Indigenous women coming into the mines. Fantastic. How is Keepers of the Circle working with the mining companies to ensure that those women stay in the mining sector or in the company?
Once upon a time, Detour Lake Gold Mine has been owned by several other companies. It is now owned by Agnico Eagle, and they, up to date, that Detour Lake Gold Mine has made significant contributions to that mine, setting it up so that there are resources available to the members while they are there on site. So not only making it a safe workplace and a nice workplace with their new camps, buildings, they also have the sports facilities, the recreational facilities. They're on a lake. People can go fishing. Fishing during the summer, they can go ice fishing in the winter. Time off is given for traditional hunts. There's a team of Indigenous advisors, including someone I'd like to give a shout out to, Howard Archibald, Senior Indigenous Advisor, Detour Lake Gold Mine, now owned by Agnico Eagle. But Howard came to present with us at PDAC, talking about what his role is at the mine and why his role is so important to the Indigenous peoples going to the mine and being able to stay at the mine and work through issues at the mine and not have to go running home to go take care of issues. So some of the barriers to employment that we address while they are with us are things like childcare, transportation, driver's licenses. Sometimes it's about looking at records and making sure that that record is not going to impede upon their placement at the mine, because some some records will keep you out of going to the mine, and you would need a pardon before you could get into that mine if you have certain charges. So not only do they have to pass a drug test, they got to pass a physical test, and they have to have a criminal record check, as well as a driver's license.
And I think
So
for mining companies listening, oh, sorry, Kathy, I just wanted to say that I think for mining companies listening, these are very practical things that we can do and initiate right away with the
yes,
support of organizations like Keeper of the Circle and like IWIMRA and others. So it's we often think that there's such a big barrier to actually actioning these things, but if we actually stop and listen to the stories, then we can figure out how to weave that in. And I love the, giving time off for traditional hunters during that traditional hunting season. Those things are very important to be inclusive and to really embed Indigenous communities into the organization. And look, we could talk about this all day, but I really want to talk about, Kathy, you've mentioned such great progress in how we're being inclusive, and I'd love to hear about some other good practice or good stories that we've heard recently or that we've participated in to break down some of these barriers from some of the other women. So, Lana, I see that you've unmuted because I know that you have something to add, and I'll get to you 1 second. I wanted to bring Mirandani in just to talk about how WIMSA is working towards actually breaking down something that's quite common across the board, which is the unconscious bias. And I know that this is not only from an Indigenous women in mining, this is also Black women in mining, and it's a very important issue to me, or trans. So I think that I think that Morandani, you can add now in terms of this, the issue of unconscious bias, and are we working towards breaking this down? And if not, what do we need to do? What's WIMSA doing to help facilitate this?
I believe the issue of unconscious bias, as much as we've seen some sort of movement, but the movement isn't where we'd like it to be. Like I mentioned earlier on, women have been in the industry for almost 30 decades, and still there is bias towards women. So the progress is actually quite slow. And in terms of what WIMSA is doing, it's just empowering women to stand their ground, because the biggest issue is these women are fully capable as much as men, but their capability is already questioned before they even open their mouth. Just by them walking into the room, how they look, already it's, are you capable of doing this job? And one of the biggest thing is by the pushing of modernizing our mining, our mines actually, because we know that technology becomes a deal maker for women. It's a game changer for women in the industry. Most of this biasness, it was built on the fact that mining was seen as a physically demanding industry that only men will be able to achieve the outcomes. So now with automation, it's breaking down that perception that was made for mining. So it actually puts women at an advantage. And that's where now it becomes vital to start getting these women at a young age, so that upskilling and reskilling is an important thing. We've seen the mine is shifting to a more automated, it's more automated. So you need to also change your skills, change the mindset that mining has always been physically demanding. So I think the modernization of mining is also one big step towards changing the bias, because we've seen that now you don't necessarily need only men in the industry, but women also play an important role. But also through coaching and engaging with the different companies as well, just running programs with the HR departments, running programs with management as well, because they need to understand the importance of diversity and the outcomes of having a diverse workforce. So by changing that mindset and making people more conscious, because most of these judgments are made unconsciously. It's something that's inbuilt because of how we were raised, because of how we understand the culture of the industry. So making people more conscious about it, then they start making better decisions. They start looking at the bigger picture. So I think pushing that information and partnering with other state institutes, partnering with other mining companies, we've seen that starting to have traction, and we've seen that starting to now make a difference. But pushing the message, running campaigns, making people more cautious, we've seen that is starting to make a difference.
Stacy, you're on mute. Sorry, Stacy.
Sorry, I should know how to do this by now. Thanks, Amon. Yes, so I was actually going to refer to Lana in this moment, especially because the world is going through all these polycrises, net zero transition. Canada and the UK have just recently launched their critical minerals acts. And both of them, although yes, we're UK, we don't have, and I'll do this, indigenous communities, but we have communities who will probably stake claim to indigeneity to the UK. But also the Canadian Critical Minerals Act. And then there are so many regulatory frameworks appearing. And I know someone has asked about which regulations should we be looking at, which standards should we be looking at. But with all of this myriad of things happening, are we seeing more Indigenous women and more Indigenous people having a seat at the table? You're one of the few that I know of. But are we seeing an increase in representation, whether it is on boards, whether it's in shaping policies? Are we seeing this, and how much further do we have to go?
Yeah, that's a really good question. But before I answer that, I just wanted to make a comment on what Kathy said and could sort of summarize in my view. You know, for a company to be a company that really is diversified and really respects its Indigenous people and or Black people, I think it requires courage, and also it requires intentionality. I mean, there are some things that a company will have to be very intentional about before they move in that direction. But it's not to say they can't do it. You know, maybe the answer might be, well, we don't do that around here. Our culture is blah, 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 blah. But, you know, to be willing to make those changes requires courage. And so I think those are the two important things that stand out. But to answer your question, one of the corporate boards that I sit on actually contacted the TMX here in Canada and said, who can you recommend that is Indigenous to sit on our board? And my name came up, and I went through the normal process of interviewing to be on the board. And I was guided by the kind of people that I was interviewed by, and they're a group of great, great people. The company is Kodiak Copper, and we're here in BC. We're exploring for copper porphyry, and it's been a great journey so far. But it then comes back to who are the people involved with the company. So that's always kind of been my marker, the kind of person that talks to me, the kind of person that I might be working with, an openness of heart. They were all thankful that I wasn't a geologist. I'm not a geologist. And they found that, you know, yay, finally somebody who's not a geologist. But I caused them to look at things differently, to look at the world differently, to look at Indigenous people differently. And I think, you know, for us, it's been a great journey. But you know, I also know that the second corporate board that I sit on, kind of a similar story. I won't bore you with those details. But again, I knew the people involved in starting the company, and here I am on the board. And so that to me is intentionality. That to me is courage. And yeah, I think it does take that kind of decision at first before it just becomes part of a normal occurrence, either at the board level or at the management level, or in operations on the ground.
Fantastic. And it leads me to Florence, who is frozen on my screen. I don't know if Florence, you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. Lovely. But I will say that you are frozen. You look lovely, so not to worry. But in terms of what you're seeing in Australia, are you seeing an uptake of companies reaching out to the Australian Stock Exchange, for example, or to you to refer an Indigenous woman either for a position or to sit on a board, or asking you for your input in how they can move forward with Indigenous communities? Are you seeing that at all?
Yeah, look, there's definitely been a flurry of interest and intention for leadership at a board level or input at a board level across many corporate organizations. It was certainly a result as well of Juukan Gorge, which happened 2 years ago now, 2 or 3 years ago. And again, it just like what Lana was saying before with her example, it really opened people's eyes about what's really happening. And I guess, with technology and with people living in different regions or they have different lifestyles, they don't truly understand, again, how and what mining plays in an everyday life. So yes, you can certainly see that. Where that starts to then highlight opportunities for us to improve is around how do we build our capacity, what programs are out there to help us then take those steps into positions, whether it be in leadership internally in an organization and then also at a board level as well. So those are some of the things now that we're informing our network of, just so they know what's out there. Because I think when you're in operations and you're used to the same types of places of belonging, and I mean in the sense that you go to work 12 hours, you come home, and that's it. And you can be quite busy as well with your life, with all of your other commitments outside of that. So for us, it's really making space to talk about what opportunities are there, and also as well, being familiar with the language that's now being used. When we think about ESGs, when we think about social performance, the energy transition, sometimes these people don't know where or what that is or what part they can play. Feeling that isolation and distance from it sometimes then keeps you just kind of okay with going with the motion. But what we've been really proactive in trying to do is informing our women of what's actually happening, what are those bigger moving parts that are out there, and ensuring that not only Indigenous people but women and communities are part of that conversation. And like I said before, when we first started, it was this big void and a really big learning curve, because people and organizations did demand a lot of us in terms of wanting to learn more. So that was excellent. We were certainly open to it. And as operators as well, we were like, oh my gosh, how can we contribute in a space that we have no idea of, in terms of corporate governance, in terms of leadership and business and all those types of, I guess, qualifications that you don't traditionally access when you live and you're raised in a community, or you don't have access to tertiary education and such. So it's been a very complex, I think, journey in learning where we belong. But I think, with IWIMRA, we've really taken the stance of how do we own this narrative through our lens, and for us to be okay with this is how we're going to approach our future in the industry. So, and we are celebrating that very shortly. We will connect together in person, and from that we'll actually collate a data set. I don't think that's ever really been collated before, and I think for everyone in the industry globally, that will start to inform where we can go to together.
And can you tell us a little bit about this meeting in person?
Oh, definitely. Thank you. Yes. So here in Perth, in Western Australia, we'll be hosting a few hundred women in person, all operational Indigenous women from around Australia, and we'll have virtual guests as well, as we do today. to really start to understand and unpack who we are as Indigenous women in the sector, where our, what drives us every single day, and where we're going. So again, like I said, this collective data, I don't believe has been attempted before. So this can really be a baseline, certainly for us here in Australia. And of course, would love to invite all other Indigenous women and people to the conversation to really have a global snapshot for one of the very first times on where we can start together as an industry, and really measure, with this energy transition of where we can go, and what our key deliverables should be. So I think, when you asked Lana before about, what's a mechanism out there that's best practice, I believe this can be something that can also assist that.
Absolutely. I have never heard of an Indigenous Women in Mining conference before. Lana, Kathy, maybe there's one in Canada or in North America. If there is, please let us know. But it's the first time that I've heard of this type of conference. I think it's quite important for the rest of us outside of being Indigenous women in mining to participate. And I know that we can virtually. So I would highly encourage everyone on the call to share and to participate that way, because I think it's a great learning for us as well. I know that we're at time and we have a few questions, but before I say goodbye, I will ask our panelists to maybe give in 1 to 3 words. Good luck. Maybe that one snippet of wisdom as to how you think the mining sector and mining operators can build trust amongst Indigenous communities, but also amongst Indigenous women. And I say, actually, I'd like to really hone in on the Indigenous women piece. How do you think that the mining community can actually build that trust? What's that first step? You can say it in more than 3 words.
Awesome. Can I go first?
Yes, Kathy.
Okay. So there's something called reconciliation here in Canada, folks. And there's another word called reconciliation. And reconciliation, my friends, this is where it's at in our view over here. So I say to people that, do you know that by empowering Indigenous women through access to the labor market, that includes mining, that you can help heal and make a significant difference towards those Indigenous women, their families, and their communities. And when we know more, we can do more. That also that Keepers of the Circle believes that women, Indigenous women, are the keepers of the TEK. That's the traditional ecological environmental knowledge and culture. And they pass it down generation to generation. They are the backbones of their communities. They draw strength from their adversity. They're innovative, loyal, and above all, they've got a great sense of humor. They're motivated and they demonstrate their abundance of leadership qualities, and they have a preference to stay in their home communities. So when they want to stay in their home communities, that illustrates a long-term commitment to that mine, showing them you're going to have these women for an active workforce for X amount of years. These are all good things that our mines can benefit from. And we want to, over here at Keepers of the Circle, we want to co-create with the mines and co-deliver with the mines, so that we can help them address issues like physical safety and cultural safety for our Indigenous women, and maybe some of the key takeaways from our program.
And reconciliation and co-creation and co-delivery.
Yes, those are my words. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, Kathy. Lana.
I don't know if I can do it in less than 3 words, but I will use one or 2 words, early, and I'll add a 3rd word, and meaningful engagement. I think it starts there at the community level where trust can start to be built, because many communities have legacies of other industries operating in the past, and they've just, maybe had their lands destroyed, and or they're watching from the sidelines all of this material leaving their territory, and it's a new day, and maybe they don't know how quite to trust us. So it does take time, but it's again, that speaks to courage and intentionality.
Absolutely. Courage, intentionality, and early and meaningful engagement. Thanks, Lana. Murendani?
Yes, my video just went off, but I think I resonate with Lana. Early and consistent engagement with the Indigenous community, and transparency is also quite important. They need to understand what the mine is planning, what they're doing in advance. They need to feel involved and be part of the process as well. And continuous feedback. If something is not going right, trusting that let's give feedback, they understand why. But yeah, transparency, early and consistent engagement, adequate feedback, that's what builds trust.
And Florence?
All beautiful words there, but I would like to say, and this has been now our new mantra, is IWIMRA is social performance in action. So really considering, where we're moving in terms of the energy transition, all this language that's always new and evolving, us leading by action and our own, by ourselves as Indigenous women, that is social performance in action, and that's how we're impactful to what's important to us. So it's more about letting us, well, not letting us, but understanding that the actions and the things that we do are culturally safe and are right and are sound. So valuing that is important. So that is what I would like to end with. Thank you.
Wonderful. And thank you all for participating.